Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and WeissAdvice here on YouTube. In this video, I want to talk about the Slate digital virtual microphone system. This is a little bit overdue because I've had a Slate VMS mic for a very long time. For a long while, it was my travel mic. Anytime I was going anywhere with Con, I was taking that mic with me, and there were a good number of reasons, and I'll explain them in a moment. But first, I want to just explain what the VMS is for anybody who doesn't know. The idea of the virtual microphone system is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to the question, is it possible to create a microphone that can emulate any other microphone? Which is sort of a weird, almost science fiction type question, but I've always been obsessed with companies that are really taking advantage of the digital space, asking those kind of almost unrealistic questions, and then coming up with answers. So basically, there are a number of things that define the characteristics of a microphone. Those will include things like the actual build quality, the transient response of the capsule, the EQ curve of the microphone itself, the saturation curve where the harmonics start to show up, the polar pickup patterns, and a number of things along those lines. I'm probably missing a few off the top of my head, but the question is, can a microphone be designed in a way that it can emulate those other qualities? And I think the answer to that question is, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And I want to explain some of the ways in which this system works and some of the ways in which it doesn't. And I want to start by asking the big question, which is probably the question most people ask when they see this particular product. The logical question is it possible for an inexpensive microphone to accurately represent and replace an expensive microphone? And we're talking about microphones that could cost magnitudes of 10 times as much. So the answer to that requires a little bit of understanding of where microphone pricing actually comes from. And I think it's really important to note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the cost of a microphone with the cost of the componentry that goes into the microphone. And let me tell you, that is absolutely not the case. The number one thing that will influence the cost of a microphone is the demand for the microphone. The brand of the microphone, the popularity of the microphone, is going to dictate the cost far more than anything else. In fact, even in the most expensive microphones, the actual raw componentry is very inexpensive, particularly if the capsule design is being done in-house. If you have to source a capsule from another company, a high-end capsule can cost anywhere from $700 to maybe $1,000 US. And so there is a certain built-in cost to that. But the actual componentry of the capacitors and the resistors really adds up to very minimal cost at all. The actual physical cost of a microphone primarily comes down to the R&D, the actual design of the microphone, the hours spent taking those components, which are not that expensive, but figuring out how to get the absolute best out of them. Now, with all that said, do I think it's possible for an inexpensive microphone to emulate accurately and replace an expensive microphone? I think under certain conditions, the answer is yes. But in order to kind of qualify that, I think it's important to understand what the virtual microphone system is actually doing. So the idea of matching one microphone to another is actually much older than the virtual microphone system. I think that there were programs being designed even in the 90s that could take the sound of one microphone and in theory convert it to the sound of another, and doing it with various degrees of accuracy, maybe not so much. In my mind, there are two main things that sonically define the sound of a microphone, and that's going to be the frequency response of the microphone and the saturation curve of the microphone. So in order to get those to be accurate, you would need a microphone that is extremely linear and has very, very little component saturation, virtually none, and then use a digital program to apply an EQ curve and apply the saturation curve as well. Now, this is if you're designing a microphone that is meant to emulate all other microphones. If you are designing a microphone to emulate a specific microphone, you would want to take other things into consideration because there are other differences between microphones that in certain circumstances are going to be very important. And those differences can be things like the transient design, which would be very hard to digitally replicate. You would need a capsule that has incredibly accurate transient information coming in. And that's very hard to do, particularly when you are emulating large diaphragm condensers as well as small diaphragm condensers. Small diaphragm condensers tend to be the most accurate when it comes to transient design, but also the restructuring and reshaping would be extremely hard to program. Another thing that it will not do is it will not emulate the exact polar pattern pickups. Every microphone changes in terms of its entire response, whether it's omni, cardioid, or figure 8, and certain microphones you simply can't switch from one to the other. You would not be able to really design a microphone that could do that without putting in a second capsule and also a second set of programming in order to completely design around all of the different polar pattern pickups. The reality is the VMS microphone is only going to have its one cardioid pickup, and from that it's going to attempt to get as accurate as possible to the sound from there. Under most circumstances, we are really only looking for on-axis pickup. We're not typically going for off-axis response unless we're either doing something that's particularly quirky and affected, in which case I don't think accuracy is all that important, or we're doing certain types of microphone pickups like a Blumline pickup or a mid-side configuration where we really need to have like a figure 8 pattern pickup, and that is a limitation of that microphone. Now, where this microphone shines is in the saturation and EQ curves, the things that we first identify and majority of the way identify with the sound of a microphone when we are using it in the most typical ways, which is putting the microphone in front of the source and recording it. So in that respect, the virtual microphone collection to me has always sounded remarkably accurate and remarkably usable. Now, while there are those limitations that I have mentioned, there are also certain advantages. One of the big advantages is that by having a microphone that can emulate other microphones, we can change things after the fact that we wouldn't normally be able to. And sometimes that can be extremely useful. If, for example, we have a surprise session where we end up recording things that we didn't anticipate recording before, and suddenly we have this microphone. If we had one microphone that had one sound to it, we would be very much limited to that sound. Could we make it work? Absolutely. But would it be ideal? Probably not. Here, this is much closer to ideal because we'll at least be able to change the EQ response and saturation curves to fit the different sources that are showing up. So that's one advantage. The other advantage is that we can apply those EQ curves and saturation curves in creative ways and ways that you wouldn't normally do with a microphone. Sometimes I like to take soft synths or DI captures and use the software that comes with the virtual microphone system in order to create a really unique type of saturation that makes things sound a little bit more lively in a way that I couldn't necessarily do using other mechanisms. Now, this is a creative effect. It's not the intended use, but having that advantage is really nice. And of course, the other advantage is that if I'm traveling around with a microphone that costs under $1,000, and I lose or break it, it's really not the same as traveling around with a microphone that costs $6,000 and I lose or break it. It might not even be replaceable. Some of these microphones can be very rare. So the big question is, okay, outside of all of this theory, yes, a certain degree it is theoretically possible to get the sound of a much more expensive microphone in a cheaper microphone, barring the limitations of polar pattern and perhaps transient response. Okay, but how is that going to sound in practice? Is it going to be something that's truly interchangeable? And I think the fun of this video is that I've actually been recording on two microphones at the same time and periodically switching between the two. One is my Neumann U87, and the other one is the Slate Classic 87 emulation off of the Slate Virtual Microphone System mic. So I've been switching between the two, and I don't know if you noticed or not. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But my guess is that that's probably a little bit of a fun reveal. All right. So let's deep dive a little bit and compare the results from our Slate microphone versus our U87. So first, I'm going to start by playing a little clip of me talking, just using the Slate microphone here, which I have on channel 1. Is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to the question, is it possible to create a microphone that can emulate any other microphone? Which is sort of a weird, almost... Now what I want to do is bring in our Neumann U87. Is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to the question, is it possible to create... Right off the bat, one of the things that we notice the most is that there's a distinct level difference, and this is because the Slate microphone is transformerless, which makes sense because the goal of the Slate microphone is to be as clean as possible, and so every kind of step-up gain source that you put in the path is going to change the frequency response and the saturation curve. So it's going to be a lower output. Now, if this was the 70s, that might be a little bit problematic because then we would need to get our gain from the next source and we might end up pulling up more of the noise floor. However, because we're kind of in the digital world, we get a little bit of an out here. You know, Slate doesn't need to worry as much about a noise floor because once we get into the digital world, we really have about 60 to 70 dB of perfectly linear gain that we can use that will not pull up any additional noise. So the level difference really only makes a difference if we have to get our gain from somewhere else, like maybe if we're laying back to tape or something like that, in which case we are going to have to drive our preamp harder in order to get the same kind of output level. In most practical cases, I don't think this is as much of an issue today as it used to be. So let's level match these a little bit, see if we can get something a little closer here. Is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to the question, is kind of a weird concept. It's not totally level matched. I think we need maybe about another dB and a half or 2 dB a gain. Is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to is kind of a weird concept. Not quite. Let's try like that. Kind of hard to get it perfect. Is kind of a weird concept. It's the is kind of a weird concept. It's the answer to the question, is it possible to create... Okay, so now that they're kind of closely level matched, I think we can hear some of the differences a little bit more clearly. We definitely have in our U87 a specific weighting toward the lows and low mids. This is typical of most Neumann microphones. They oftentimes will saturate in the lows and low mids, and usually in a really nice way. So it's one of the more desirable qualities, even though it is not considered a flat or clean response, it is something that typically will sound pretty good. Let's check out the transient response here. Let's do the VMS. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will... And now let's check the 87. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the cost of a... So to me, without putting on the software, it actually sounds pretty similar. There might be a little bit more identification of the transients, but that might just be that the U87 is a little bit brighter in the very top end, our 7K plus kind of range where some of the articulation shows up, and maybe less because of the capsule. So now let's put on our classic 87 here, emulation. So we get a few different emulations. We get an AI, MK1, MK2, and these are all kind of going to different runs of emulation. One of the things that's tough about getting an accurate sound to a microphone is that even when you have two microphones of the same build and model, they can sound very different because, especially older ones, they start to change based on the sound. So, for example, I was under the impression that my 87 was an 87i. I read the label again and I realized it's actually an AI, but it's a very old AI. It's one of the earlier runs of the AI, so it's now about 30 years old. And it starts to sound more like the 80s 87i. So when I'm doing this, I'm actually not using the 87ai emulation here. I'm using the MK1. It's more accurate to the sound of the microphone that I'm using. So now that this is turned on, we can probably drop this additional trim. Let's play it. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the... Okay, that's VMS. Here's 87. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate... If I were to switch this, we're going to get a slightly different sound. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the cost of a microphone. Now, it's really subtle, but I notice a slightly clean, polished kind of lift in the top end, and that's not what I have here. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. What I hear in my version is actually a somewhat saturated, slightly saturated lift in the top end. And so I think it's actually more accurate to the sound if I were to switch over to this version. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. And if I were really to go out on a limb here, I would say if I added about half a dB to mid and top end, we're going to get something that's very close. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the cost of... To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate the cost of the microphone with the cost of the componentry that goes into the microphone. And let me tell you, that is absolutely not the case. The number one thing... So I do hear a very slight difference. There is a little bit more of a slightly saturated quality to the Neumann U87 around like the 1.5K range in sort of a broad way. I think because my microphone is older, there's a little bit more component saturation. Maybe some of it has come ever so slightly out of spec, or maybe that's just one of those things where the accuracy is not entirely completely there. There is a slight bit more saturation that I'm getting from my 87 than I'm getting from the virtual microphone system here. To note that there is a lot that goes into the actual price of the microphone. Most people will associate... It is pretty darn close, though. I would say it is pretty darn close. I think maybe if I turn up this gain like 0.2 dB, something like that, it's going to get really interchangeable. Works and some of the ways in which it doesn't. And I want to start by asking the big question. Works and some of the ways in which it doesn't. And I want to start by asking the big question, which is probably... Works and some of the ways in which it doesn't. And I want to start by asking the big question, which is probably the question... That's pretty crazy close. There is like this touch of, I can hear it a little bit more clearly now that it's a little more level matched. There is this like slight touch of saturation that goes from maybe about 750 hertz to maybe about like 1.5 to 1.8K, like that area of mid-range where there's just a touch of saturation. Pretty similar though, pretty darn similar. So, yeah, in short, you know, when I was talking about this video to my fiance, she was saying like, well, what would you recommend to somebody who was starting out? Would you recommend that they should get something like a U87, or do you think that a microphone like the virtual microphone system would be better for them? And she sort of proposed a few reasons why she could see the U87 being a better pick. But in my opinion, actually, I would suggest the virtual microphone system. I mean, aside from the fact that if somebody new happens to break it, you know, you're not out nearly as much money, but also because it kind of introduces you to the ability to kind of get things wrong a little bit. You can pick the wrong microphone and change it later, and I think for a beginner that's very useful. I think if you're walking into situations that you don't necessarily have a full scope on, having something like this would be very, very useful. And I think that it's also a good learning mechanism because it's accurate enough to the sound of the microphones where you'll get to understand the differences between the sounds you get from like Classic 87 versus Blackbird 251 versus their 414 or, the various other microphones that you can pick. And it is a pretty extensive list. So, yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's my take on it. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up this video here. This is a nice video to kind of introduce what we're going to be doing next week, which is going to be Microphone Week. I'm going to be talking about microphones quite a bit. I think we're going to learn a bit. Remember that the low-end guide is still free if you sign up for the newsletter until the end of the year. But at the beginning of 2023, that is going to be going on sale for $37. So get it for free now. All right, guys, let's wrap up here. If you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.